Greetings, YouTube. This is Remarkable Republican, bringing you the truth with a truth-flavored bias. We're looking at Yakuza Like a Dragon, or as it is sometimes more popularly called, Yakuza 7. This game is a big departure in the series. Before, we'd follow a single hero, sometimes in sequence, or sometimes just one character for the whole game. In this case, we have a main character and a bunch of side characters around him, and they form a kind of combat team. This game is more like a tactical game in that you lead a small gang around when you fight. Our main character is a guy named Ichiban Kasuga. We'll talk more about him as we go along. And even though I've been critical of Kiryu in the past, I gotta say, I really wish we had had Kiryu instead, because this guy just ain't it. In the earlier games, we play as some of the big deal Yakuza, guys who are in charge of families or are recognized as the best fighters in the Tojo clan. But with Ichiban Kasuga, we play as this guy who really isn't much. He seems like a nice enough guy, but he is a nobody. He's a new recruit, he's not that strong or anything, and he also is very humble. So your normal Yakuza is somebody who goes around and fights a lot, but Ichiban is mostly a manservant for the patriarch's son. So his boss, who we'll get into in a minute, has a son who is wheelchair bound. And the son is kind of whiny and complains a lot, and it's up to Ichiban to take care of him. And we don't know exactly how far this goes. It wouldn't be surprising if Ichiban was wiping this guy's ass, but that is kind of what his job is when we meet him. We also learn about his backstory, and he also comes from nowhere, so he doesn't have a mysterious past where he might be someone who is about to inherit the Tojo clan, like remember with Kiryu. Instead, he's raised at a brothel, or as they call it in the game, a soapland, and we don't really know what happened to his mom, so that's pretty weird, because there are lots of people who don't know who their dad is. He doesn't know who his mom is. And so his mom disappeared a long time ago. His father is also a mystery. We don't know who his parents are. And he's kind of just raised by all the women collectively. So he's raised by a community of prostitutes. And not surprisingly, of course, they fail as mothers, and he ends up becoming a Yakuza. Then, because he is a low-level nobody and he has no family, they decide to frame him for a crime someone else commits, and he gets sent to prison for 20 years. So while he's in prison, Japanese prison doesn't really have visitors the way that American prison does. He comes out, and all of a sudden the world is different. So he goes from the 90s to, I believe, 2019 or 2020. And so the world is radically different. He doesn't know what's happening, and he also has nowhere to go because he has no family, and he doesn't know where his friends are either. So that's kind of where the story goes. You'll notice too the suit of armor. He's a guy who has a lot of delusions about being a hero, and so he often thinks about how cool it will be to wear armor. And at certain points in the game, he actually will get a suit of armor and wear it around town, which is bizarre to say the least. Ichiban Kasuga, we know who he is now, so let's talk about why he is not a very good main character. First of all, he has a strange obsession with his boss, Patriarch Akawara. It's okay to have friends, mentors, or people you look up to, but with Ichiban, he's like a dog for Akawara. And in fact, one of the early plot points is that he meets up with Akawara finally, and Akawara shoots him and then dumps him for dead. And yet Ichiban knows that he must have some kind of good reason, and he tries desperately to get in contact with Akawara and to help him. And that, to me, is not really befitting of a hero. We need someone who's more independent-minded, someone like Kiryu who can actually hold his own in a major fight. Whereas with Ichiban, he is simply looking for Akawara to tell him what to do. So he's not a leader, really. He also has a strange hairstyle called a punch perm. This was cool in Japan in the late 90s, and it's one of those things they abandoned immediately because it sucks. So it's kind of like a Japanese mullet. It would be the best analogy I can think of. He also is kind of this guy who suffers from arrested development. So he's in his early 40s. He spent most of his 20s and 30s and then up until his early 40s in prison. And you would think that he would have grown up in that time, that he would have kept up with society in some way, maybe reading magazines or something. But apparently he just sat and stared at the wall the whole time. And so when he comes out, he's still very immature. And if anything, he regressed and he acts like a 12-year-old. One thing you'll notice is that he does not understand women at all. Unlike Kiryu and Majima, he's not a homosexual, but he simply does not understand how women work, and he gets super nervous around them. So a lot of women try to make offers to him, and he doesn't really know how to respond. So again, kind of a weak hero. A guy who is kind of like the 40-year-old virgin, except that he fights on the streets as a Yakuza rather than working at Best Buy or whatever the 40-year-old virgin did. Another thing about Ichiban that's really weird is that he's obsessed with the Dragon Quest franchise, and that is a franchise by Nintendo. So, again, the Yakuza series is made by Sega, and Sega and Nintendo are supposed to be rivals. So why not make him a fan of Final Fantasy or something else that's more Sega-oriented? I don't get it, but this is the choice they went with. And so even though Ichiban himself is not exactly an alpha male, he's still somehow cucking the franchise that gave him life. It's very strange. So Ichiban is a bum himself, a guy who has no leadership ability, and yet he will be the leader of a team. And as we meet this team, we realize that these are people even more pathetic and ridiculous than Ichiban. The first one we meet is a guy named Nanba. So when Ichiban is shot and thrown into the streets, Nanba nurses him back to health. In fact, Nanba was an out-of-work nurse who got fired because he was obsessed with some girl half his age and took the fall for something she did wrong at work. So Nanba is a strange character to say the least. And I guess we can say in his defense, he is a good friend, and without him, Ichiban would have died. We also get the love interest for Ichiban, the woman that he's obsessed with, Saiko. In many ways, she is the Japanese AOC. She comes across as very stuck up, and she also seems like somebody who is looking for handouts. She also is a bartender by trade, and then she has a job class called barmaid, which makes her do bartender moves in battle, which is probably the worst class in the game. Another person we meet early on is a failed detective named Adichie. And Adichie is an older guy who worked at the Japanese DMV and got fired for trying to continue to look into cases that were outside of his jurisdiction. So he's kind of a delusional guy who thinks that he's like a homicide detective, but he's just there to do driving tests. So he's also out of work and more or less homeless. We then meet a few other characters as the story goes along. So all of these three characters come in early, and then we get more. One of them is a guy who used to be a body double for a now dead Korean gangster, and his name is Jun Gahan. So he's just taken on the identity of this dead leader. And he walks around without a shirt and does martial arts. And this is also someone who had a homoerotic duel with Kiryu. At least the original Jun Gahan did. This guy is just role-playing as Jun Gahan full-time. So he lives a world of delusion. Which I guess is kind of like in Final Fantasy VII, another Sega game, where we learn that Cloud thinks that he's Zack, or like he's lost recognition of who he was, and he thinks like his life was Zack's life. We also have a guy who's a gangster chef named Zhao. He's kind of a tall, skinny guy who's weird looking with like Beatles glasses. And he doesn't really want to be the leader of the gang, but he inherited the position from his dad. He also makes eyes at Jun Gahan a lot, and there's a very gay energy there. I'm not sure if Jun Gahan is interested in him too, but Zhao definitely seems to be gay for Jun Gahan. Zhao has a pretty cool sword though, but other than that, He is mostly just obsessed with cooking, which, again, I don't understand why he would prefer to be a chef over leading the Chinese mafia in a city. And the final character we get is a very young woman named Aerie. So most of these other characters are a little bit older. They're probably like 40-ish, but Aerie's about 20, and she is the heiress to a cookie making place. And she needs a lot of business guidance. And surprisingly, she turns to Ichiban for that guidance, as we'll see, even though he's never run a business or anything else. The other Yakuza games are set in real cities and in slightly fictionalized versions of the red light districts. So for instance, the main area that you play as in most of the Kiryu games is a real part of Tokyo. In this game, they decided to take things up a notch and create an entirely new city so they could do what they wanted. So they created a red light district called a Gensho, and then they made up an entirely new city called Yokohama. I assume that one of the people there is a real tire fan because this is the name of a tire company. It's also likely that maybe Yokohama gave them money for the game. Sega's not doing very well financially, so maybe Yokohama had bought Sega. I imagine there's a story there, I just haven't found it yet. But that's not really too important for right now reviewing the game. This city is very trashy, so not only is it covered in litter, so it's unlike real Japanese cities that are very orderly and well managed, it also has a big immigrant problem. So you have lots of Koreans and Chinese there, so maybe a third or fewer of the people there are actually Japanese. And this leads to a lot of ethnic fighting, so all three of these groups don't like each other and fight, and each one has their own gangs. That being said, even though I kind of like the idea that they created their own city for this, it's just not as interesting as a real city. It doesn't have the kind of lived-in dynamic and the kind of built-in real history as a real city. So I wish they had spent a little more time developing this and making it more realistic. Another problem is that because of Ichiban's delusions and his obsession with Dragon Quest, he imagines the bad guys they fight being like mutants. And so a lot of them will just wear garbage around, and it's not clear, because we do fight a lot of homeless people, it's not clear whether this is kind of what they actually look like, but exaggerated, or whether it's just purely Ichiban having a weird delusion. And so that part of the game is very confusing. And it also means you fight a lot of goofy looking bad guys that it's hard to take seriously. Yakuza games are often complicated and sometimes way too much. This game would have been a lot better if they had eliminated all the side stories and then cut out maybe 25% of the main story. So, to make the game more realistic, they needed to really cut down the number of characters and factions and also limit what Ichiban and his friends are involved in. As things stand, it's really hard to remember who did what and how they did it, and also to believe that this group of miscreants was able to accomplish all that. So, one problem is that there are a lot of factions here. You've got a Korean mafia, Chinese mafia, a local Yakuza group of Japanese people. You didn't have the Tojo clan, the Omi Alliance. So you've got lots and lots of players on the map. And Ichiban, who's been in prison for 20 years, does not possibly understand what's happening. Yet he and his friends will become the centerpiece of conspiracies ranging through the whole country. There's also a major political dynamic. We'll talk about how Akawara's son, the guy that Ichiban had cared for as a youth, had grown up and taken on a new identity, and he was now the leading politician in Japan under the name Aoki. And so Ichiban and his friends will get sucked into this hurricane of political whatever, and they have to resolve it, even though at this time there also are much more important heroes around. Majima's still around. Majima's big friend is still around. Kiryu is there. But instead, we're looking at Ichiban and his bum friends. And they are the ones who are going to rescue Japan and save the Yakuza. Also, other than Kiryu, none of those guys are even in the Yakuza. So all of this is super weird. Speaking of Kiryu, he will be in the game, and he actually is a guy you have to fight as a boss. He'll emerge from hiding. He faked his own death, and now he's basically a CIA agent. And so he comes out of hiding to help Ichiban, and then goes back into hiding. So Kiryu is kind of wasted in this, and it doesn't make sense why we don't have him as a character. Another thing that doesn't make sense is that Aries' company is something that will be entrusted to her, although her grandmother's still alive and well. So her grandmother should have inherited it from her late husband, but instead it goes to the granddaughter, who doesn't know what she's doing. And she has to turn to Ichiban, who again is a guy who grew up in a whorehouse, has no education, and spent his whole life in prison. And yet Ichiban is able to run the company better than Eri and her grandmother and make them a bunch of money. And by the way, Eri never gives Ichiban any of that money. So Ichiban will be poor at the end of the game, even though he's apparently the head of a Fortune 500 company. That makes sense to me. And of course, not only, even though all these characters are super unqualified and incapable, they still manage to save Japan, and they still manage to defeat all of these really high-level foes because they work together as a team and jerk off over Dragon Quest. So, again, everything about this game is ultra unrealistic and ridiculous, and I really wish they had been a little bit more grounded here. Because I think if you took the basic story and made it more about them playing a small role, this actually would have been a really cool game and story. But they made it a little too ridiculous, so it kind of ruined everything. In other Yakuza games, sometimes nasty things happen, like there are perverts running around with thongs, and you also have some dating games where like they imply that things happen or that Kiryu gets sexually assaulted or whatever. But this game takes it to a whole different level in terms of disgusting things that happen in the game. So early in the game, Ichiban, Nanba, and Adachi will go visit a brothel. And it's a small one. They befriend the madam of the place, and she allows them to sleep there. And they lay on these mats that are clearly covered in cum stains. And rather than putting down like a sheet or something to cover up and protect themselves, they just lay their faces right on it. So that was pretty gross. And it also establishes that these guys are total losers and bums. But even most bums, I think, would have enough sense and self-preservation to protect themselves from cum stains. Later on, they get a more clean hideout by being allowed to stay in the junk room of a bar called Survive, where they also go to hang out, drink, and do karaoke. But in this back room, they are there, and they're at the invitation of the shady guy who runs it, a guy who really doesn't have a name. He's just like this really tall guy with a big scar who looks like a criminal. And they're lucky this guy wasn't just selling them out to organized crime, because he looks like a guy who'd be a criminal of some sort. I have to imagine, too, that given how shady this guy is, that Psycho or Eri was having to give him BJs or something to pay for the rent, because he doesn't seem like a very charitable guy. He also makes them lunch boxes, so if they bring him food items, he will prepare lunches for them. So the whole thing is really weird. And anyway, there's also a girl who works there that flirts with Ichiban. The whole thing is very strange, and the arrangement seems like there's probably more being implied, and it's probably not very appropriate. Another thing that's really disgusting about their behavior is that although these are all people who are struggling to stay fed and have a roof over their heads, every time they get money, they go out and waste it all at cabaret clubs to flirt with girls. And I have to imagine that smelling like cum-stained mats and garbage would make it a miserable experience for the girls who are forced to hang out with them at the cabaret clubs. Also, at the cabaret clubs, you can bring the women in your party. So it's also really disrespectful to Psycho and Eri to not only go to these clubs and talk about it, but to make them come along too. So anyway, this is a pretty degenerate group. I mean, Kiryu was plenty degenerate, but there was at least like a thin layer of respectability. These guys just don't care at all. These guys just let it all hang out, and maybe some reserve is something that would be good here. At least put a sheet over the cum stain mat. Speaking of things that are disgusting and inappropriate, let's talk about how this game glorifies criminals, especially criminals from previous games who are Tojo Clan legends, and that word gets used a lot in the game. So Kiryu, Majima, Saejima, and Daigo, who are all leaders of the Tojo Clan, are really held up as being really cool, moral people who are selflessly acting to help ex-Yakuza and save the country. And while Kiryu did have a little bit of a noble streak, I don't think that applies to Majima, Saejima, or Daigo. Remember, Daigo is the chairman of the Tojo clan. He's raking in billions of dollars from all this stuff. There's nothing noble about him. He's also incompetent. He can't win on his own. Every time he gets in trouble, Kiryu had to bail him out. So these guys are not to be looked up to. Now, the only thing I can think of is that because Ichiban is a low-level guy, that he looks up to them the way that privates look up to generals. But he doesn't see any of their flaws. He doesn't see how they suck at what they're doing, or how their plan doesn't make sense. And once again, that goes back to Ichiban being a poor main character, because he is dumb. Another thing that sucks is that Ichiban and his friends cannot beat any of these guys. So even if you spend time leveling up and gaining new abilities, when you fight these guys, you're not allowed to win the fight. So you might win in-game, but then the cutscene shows that actually you lost. Or that you were saved by the bell, or whatever it might be. So you're not actually allowed to beating these guys up, and even though you outnumber them and have all these abilities, you still can't win, because they're just that amazing and that special. So once again, you wonder, well, why not just play as Daigo and Majima if they're so much better than the guys I have? Why bother leveling up Psycho and Adachi and all these others if they can never be on the same level as Kiryu? So again, they really screwed this up, and I wish they had put more thought into this. Ichiban's not a very good main character, but we can feel some sympathy for him because he just wants to have a family. He just wants to have friends and people he can rely on. And so he actually will have a very tearful meeting with Akawara Jr., also known as Aoki, the guy who was the evil politician, and the guy who was behind all the trouble in the game. So he's revealed as the big bad in the end. So he had gotten over his disability. You have to fight him in the end. And then Ichiban will beg him not to commit suicide and to live on and to be brothers, because he feels like they kind of were brothers. And he also gets this weird fantasy in his head that Akawara was his actual dad. And actually you get the option of dressing like Akawara with the leather coat. Another weird thing too is we learn Akawara was a professional hitman. So that was his specialty as a Yakuza, was killing people. And yet Ichiban looks up to him as being like this kind, gentle soul. So the whole thing is really weird, but if you understand that Ichiban is totally fucked in the head, it kind of makes sense. And despite this long quest, and despite being willing to overlook really glaring flaws and horrible actions on behalf of both these men, Ichiban just wants to live with them like a family. Well, Akawara dies, and then his son also gets shot. So in the end, after coming all this way, and after sleeping on cum-stained mattresses, befriending a bunch of bums, fighting people way stronger and getting your ass kicked, Ichiban also ran for office at one point, got humiliated. So he went through hell for these guys, and he couldn't save them. So technically he's a failure, and in the end he has no family. So he kind of starts out where he began. So if he were to rewind his life all the way back to when he was 18, I believe he's about, 42-ish when the game starts. So literally, his whole life was a waste. He was seeking a family by joining Yakuza and the Akawara family, And at the end, there is no Akawara or Akawara family. The Yakuza don't exist anymore because Ichiban helped to disband them. And the members of that family are all dead. So it's a very sad game. Ichiban is an orphan, and he's someone who, because of his mental limitations, needs an adult authority figure to tell him what to do. Well, he was interested in Psycho, but he doesn't really know what to do with women, and so he can't get her to bed. And we end up with them not being a thing. Eri has an interest in him, but he doesn't really understand the signs. So he could have been with either one of them as a girlfriend, and they could have like run his life for him, but instead he can't seal the deal, so he's still single. So all he accomplished in the end after all of this was making a few friends with people who also are just nobodies. He became popular locally in the city named after a tire company, and he also will pick up a job at the unemployment office. So earlier in the game you can go there to pick up jobs. He will now become a guy who helps people find temporary work. And so, even though he's a nice guy, again, he was a terrible main character. And if you think about it, he really didn't do anything in terms of accomplishment. He doesn't do anything that has a lasting impact. Everything he tried failed. And so that's why this game is Yakuza like a bum. If he had been like a dragon, the impact of what he did would have mattered. But instead, he's just like a homeless guy who danced a little jig for a few coins and then went back to sleep in his box. So, Ichiban, I really hope, will be a character that Sega drops because he just isn't compelling. Maybe he'd be good as like a side character, as just one of the members of your crew, and you can laugh at how ridiculous he is and how pathetic. And maybe you have like one or two good scenes where his kind-heartedness is kind of cool. But for the most part, you should not have this guy as a main character. So, I still think you can do better than Kiryu, but this ain't it. Until next time, I'm Remarkable Republican, bringing you the truth with a truth-flavored bias, signing out.